Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me be very honest and tell you that there is much in this bill, and we have not yet seen the printout yet, that I am concerned about. I am especially concerned that the administration will be able to expend $500 billion in virtually any way they want, any corporation they want, with virtually no strings attached. The American people, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, do not want more corporate welfare, and they do not want policies which will allow corporations, in some cases, to receive loans or grants and then do stock buybacks to enrich their stockholders, provide dividends, or maybe raise the compensation benefits of their already wealthy CEOs. What the American people want right now is for us to use our taxpayer dollar in every way that we can to protect the working families of this country, to protect the middle class, to protect the 50% of our people who are living paycheck to paycheck. And as we speak tonight, half of our people in this country, in the richest country in the history of the world, are living paycheck to paycheck. And they wake up in the morning and they're saying, you know what, I can barely make it on the paycheck that I got because I'm making 12, 13, 14 bucks an hour, and now that paycheck has stopped. How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to put food on the table for my kids? How am I going to make sure that the lights remain on? How am I going to pay my student debt? How am I going to pay my credit card debt? Somebody in the family gets sick. How am I going to pay that? Now, this bill has been worked on extensively in the last few days. There are elements in it that, in my view, are positive. Don't go far enough by any means. But one of the things this bill does do is provide the largest expansion of unemployment benefits in history, expending about $250 billion of federal funds. And what it does, importantly, the bill understands that for all kinds of absurd reasons having to do with Republican attacks on workers for many years, fewer than 50% of American workers today are eligible for unemployment benefits. What this bill does is says, rightly so, that in the midst of this terrible economic crisis where some people, nobody knows, where some economists are estimating that by June, the end of next quarter, unemployment could be 20 or 30%, what this bill does say is that whether or not you are eligible for unemployment today, you're going to get unemployment compensation. And that means many of the gig workers, people who drive Uber cars, many of the waitresses and waiters who make starvation minimum wages, many so-called independent contractors, they will be eligible for the extended unemployment benefit. That is exactly the right thing. And the other thing that this bill does, which is right, is it says, okay, we are in the midst of a horrific crisis, unprecedented in modern American history. So not only are you going to get your regular unemployment benefits, we're going to add another $600 a week to it. And now I find that some of my Republican colleagues are very distressed. They're very upset that somebody who's making 10, 12 bucks an hour might end up with a paycheck for 4 months more than they received last week. Oh my God, the universe is collapsing. Imagine that. Somebody who's making 12 bucks an hour, now like the rest of us, faces an unprecedented economic crisis with the 600 bucks on top of their regular unemployment check, might be making a few bucks more for 4 months. Oh my word, will the universe survive? How absurd and wrong is that? What kind of value system is that? Meanwhile, these very same folks had no problem a couple of years ago voting for $1 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and large profitable corporations. Not a problem. But when it comes to low-income workers in the midst of a terrible crisis, maybe some of them earning or having more money than they previously made, oh my word, we got to strip that out. Got to tell those poor people that no matter what. And by the way, when the McConnell bill first came up, unbelievably, and I know many Republicans objected to this, they were saying that, well, we want to give whatever it was, $1,000 or $1,200, but poor people should get less. You see, because poor people are down here, they don't deserve, they don't eat, they don't pay rent, they don't go to the doctor, they're somehow inferior because they're poor, we're going to give them less. Well, that was addressed. Now everybody is going to get the $1,200. But some of my Republican friends still have not given up on the need to punish the poor and working people. You haven't raised the minimum wage in 10 years. Minimum wage should be at least $15 an hour. You haven't done that. You've cut program after program after program, and now, horror of horrors, for 4 months, workers might be earning a few bucks more than they otherwise went. Well, needless to say, this is an amendment that is coming up. I don't think it's going to go very far. And if it does go far, I will introduce an amendment to deal with the corporate welfare, the $500 billion in corporate welfare, which is, to me, a very serious problem. But I do not think they're going to get the 60 votes, and that will be the end of it. Mr. President, this bill also includes some $250 billion in one-time checks of $1,200 for adults and $500 for kids. Now, I have a couple of concerns there. Number one, I have believed that in the midst of this unprecedented crisis, that we should make this a monthly benefit, not a one-time benefit. And depending on what happens, and I expect very much that this Congress will be reconvening, because I think this coronavirus 3, the bill we're on right now, is going to be superseded by a coronavirus 4, because my strong guess is this does not go far enough. But the bill does include a $1,200 check for adults, $500 for kids. That will help in the short term. We've got to do a lot better than that. As many of you know, in countries around the world, UK, Denmark, other countries, the approach that they are taking, which makes sense to me, is to basically say to employers, if you keep your workers on the job, even if they're not working right now, we will pay, in the UK case, 80% of their salary. Other countries a bit higher. I think that is the direction we should have gone. This is a little bit more convoluted. But what we do here is give $367 billion in loans to small businesses, and those loans could be forgiven if those small businesses don't lay off workers. And I think for a variety of reasons, that is exactly the right thing to do. The goal right now is to stabilize the economy by telling workers that they will have their jobs when they come back, when this thing is over, and that in the meantime, they will have all or most of their income. That is my preferred approach. This bill provides $150 billion to states and cities. And I can tell you that in Vermont, and I'm sure in every other state in this country, states and cities are hurting because we all know there has been a major decline in tax revenue. And that is an important thing to do because, by the way, in the midst of this crisis, a lot of the responsibility is going to fall on local and state government. And one of the concerns of many that I have about this bill is that in the best of times, this bill requires an enormous amount of work by the federal, state, and local governments. How do you get all these unemployment checks out? How do you deal with all of these small businesses who may apply for these loans? This is hard stuff, and it becomes even more difficult when so many workers who work for local and state government are not coming into work because of the coronavirus. And one of the issues that we are going to have to focus on big time is the implementation. If anyone thinks just passing this bill, tomorrow everything is going to flow smoothly, you are terribly mistaken. This is a complicated, multifaceted bill, and it is going to take an enormous amount of work to make sure that the money goes where it should go in a cost-effective way. This bill does a lot of other things as well that I think will help the American economy. So to conclude, Mr. President, This is not the bill that I would have written. Frankly, I don't think it's the bill that most Americans would have written. I think most Americans are very, very apprehensive that 1/4 of this bill is going to go to large corporations with very little accountability. And in a political system, let me make the radical suggestion that we have a president of the United States who may end up targeting some of this money to states that he needs to win. So this bill has some good things. It has some issues of real concern. But one thing we must not do is to punish low-income workers who might get a few bucks more than they previously earned. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
And let me thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. Let me thank Bob Reich for that introduction. As I think all of you know, Bob was one of the great secretaries of labor in the history of the United States and is a phenomenal educator, not only here at Berkeley, but his writings are getting all over the country. So Bob, thank you so much for all that you do. I want to talk a little bit about the book, but I suspect there are one or two other things on your minds as well. So I'll touch on those things. Number one, Donald Trump lost the popular vote by over 2 million votes. And the importance of that is that you have got to know, and sometimes even our delusional president-elect has got to understand, that he does not have a mandate. He does not have a mandate. Number two, and even more importantly, on every major issue facing this country, poll after poll shows that the American people prefer a progressive agenda. In other words, there is a time and a place where somebody could say, well, you know what, nobody agrees with me, but I'm going to stand with this position, I'm right, and that's fine. But on every major issue facing this country, the American people want progressive change. The American people want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. That's not me, that's not you, that is the American people. The American people overwhelmingly believe it is absurd that in the year 2016, women are making 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. They want pay equity. The American people understand there is something profoundly wrong when in a highly competitive global economy, we have a dysfunctional child care pre-K system. Hundreds of thousands of bright young people are unable to afford to go to college. Millions leave school deeply in debt. The American people want public colleges and universities to be tuition-free and for us to substantially lower student debt. Again, I say that not because it's a good idea, it's an idea that I believe to be right or that most of you believe to be right. It is what the American people want. The American people, Republicans and Democrats, think that it is absurd and grossly unfair that billionaires like Donald Trump in a given year pay nothing in federal income tax and that many multinational corporations making billions in profit pay nothing in taxes. The American people want progressive tax reform. The American people, whether they are Republican, conservative, moderate, Democrat, progressives, understand that our current campaign finance system is corrupt. And the American people understand that too many people, too many brave Americans, have fought and died to preserve American democracy, and that it is wrong that a handful of billionaires are now able to spend, as a result of Citizens United, unlimited sums of money to buy elections. The American people know democracy is one person, one vote, not billionaires buying elections. And the American people understand that with 11 million undocumented people in this country, many of them working tirelessly, many of them getting ripped off on the job because they have no legal protection, the American people do believe that we need to move to comprehensive immigration reform and a path toward citizenship. Again, that's not my idea. I'm not here telling you what I think. I am telling you what the American people believe. The American people know, and some conservatives actually have been strong on this issue, that it is totally insane that we have more people in jail today than any other country on earth, more than China, 4 times our size. We are spending $80 billion a year locking up 2.2 million Americans. And whether you're conservative or progressive, you understand that makes a hell of a lot more sense investing in jobs and education rather than jails and incarceration. Now, I say that to tell you that we, in terms of our views, are the majority, and that many, many people who voted for Trump for whatever reason support virtually everything that I have just listed off. Now, as we move into the Trump era, let me just say the following. There are areas I think there can be some compromise. There are areas where there can be no compromise. And the area of first concern, where there cannot and must be compromise, is beating back the Trump campaign, where the cornerstone of that campaign was bigotry. No compromise with bigotry. No compromise with racism, with sexism, with homophobia, with xenophobia. On that issue, we will not compromise. I don't have to explain to anybody here at this great university the painful and rocky road that this country has traveled with regard to all forms of bigotry, starting before this country even became a country, when the first settlers came here and did terrible, awful things to the Native American people, awful, terrible things which continue to this day. And I don't have to tell anybody here about the abomination of slavery or the fact that African Americans did not have the right to vote in many states in this country. I don't have to explain to anybody here, because you all know history, that 100 years ago today, women in America were not running for president. They did not have the right to vote. And I don't have to explain to people here that 100 plus years ago, children of 10, 12 years of age were working in factories, losing their fingers and their hands, working on machinery that children should not have been near. But as a result of the struggles in all of these areas and in other areas, if we were sitting here 5 years ago, 8 years ago, and somebody jumped up and said, you know, Bernie, I think by the year 2015, gay marriage will be legal in every state in this country, the rest of the audience would have told that person, you're crazy, it can't happen. It did happen because people stood up and fought back. So 2 points that I want to make in that regard. Number one, this country, through incredibly brave people, some of whom went to jail, were beaten, some of whom died. This country has made significant improvements in becoming a less discriminatory society. Do we still have racism and sexism and homophobia? Of course we do. But we should be proud of the progress that we have made. If we were here 20 years ago, believe me, and somebody jumps up and says, we're going to have an African-American president in 2008 and re-elect him 4 years later with a good vote, people would have thought that would have been impossible. We have made progress in becoming a less discriminatory society. And what I say to Mr. Trump, we are not going backwards, we're going forwards. So no compromise on bigotry, none at all. Second area that I think we have got to be very attentive to, and where I also believe that there just cannot be any compromise. Mr. Trump campaigns all over the country and tells the American people that climate change is a hoax. Well, Mr. Trump, you got to start listening to scientists and not just the fossil fuel industry. Climate change is not a hoax. It is a painful, dangerous reality. Climate change is real. It is caused by human activity. It is already, as most of you know, already causing horrific problems in our country and around the world. What we are talking about is the future of the planet. What we are talking about are the kind of lives that our kids and our grandchildren and future generations will experience. We as human beings, along with people all over this globe, we are the custodians of this, our only planet. We cannot turn our backs on this planet. We are going to take on the fossil fuel industry and transform our energy system. And the third area where I think there cannot be any compromise is the very nature of American democracy. Now, what democracy is about is sometimes you win elections and sometimes you lose elections. But where we are moving right now are two areas of great concern. Number one, as a result of Citizens United, as I just mentioned, billionaires can now spend unlimited sums of money to buy elections. What all of you should know is that for the Koch brothers and for the billionaire class in general, and for the leadership of the Republican Party, Citizens United has not gone far enough. Right now, what Citizens United means is the Koch brothers and other billionaires can spend unlimited sums of money in terms of quote-unquote independent expenditures. So they can put all the ads they want and do all kinds of other things independently of the candidate who they are supporting. What they want to do, and they're very upfront about it, is end all forms of campaign finance regulation. They want to move toward the day when the Koch brothers can give a check to an individual, say somebody's running for the Senate in California, give that person directly a check for $500 million or $300 million or whatever it may be, and say, there is your campaign manager, there's your speechwriter, there is your media consultant. You work for me. You are my employee. It's my money, I own you. That is where the Republican Party is moving. Second of all, equally important, when Trump sends out a delusional tweet the other day, and I mean the word delusional, which says, I, Donald Trump, would have won the popular vote, or did win the popular vote, except for the fact that millions of people voted illegally, that is an insane statement. But, I mean, it's not just not backed up by any fact. Nobody, no Republican believes that. Nobody believes that. But I think I understand what he was really saying. What he was really sending out was a message to Republican operatives and governors and so forth that you go forward aggressively in voter suppression. So right now you have all over this country states which have worked overtime as a result of a disastrous Supreme Court decision some years ago which gutted the Voting Rights Act. And they will try to make it harder for people of color, for poor people, for old people, for young people to participate in the political process. So you add those two things together. Number one, billionaires buying elections. Number two, a major effort at the state level and maybe at the national level trying to make it harder for people to vote. You will have the Republican dream of democracy. Money buying elections and people in opposition to their ideas not being able to vote. People in this country, as I said before, have fought and died to defend American democracy. And I tell Mr. Trump and his friends, we will not surrender American democracy. Democracy is one person, one vote. We are going to make it easier for people to participate in the political process, not harder. And our goal is public funding of elections, not billionaires buying elections. So among many other issues of great concern to you and to me, those are three where I just don't see any room for compromise. Not compromise on bigotry, not compromise on climate change, and not compromise on protecting American democracy. Now, a lot of people are asking, how did it happen? How did Mr. Trump win? And one of the things that exists, not a good thing in our country, is we live in a silo-wise society where we all talk to our friends, people who share our views by and large. So there are many people who say, God, I don't know how Trump could have won. Nobody I know voted for him. And then there are Trump supporters who say, I can't believe that Clinton got 2 million more votes than Trump. Nobody I know voted for Clinton. And in a sense, both groups are right. But I do want to tell you one of the reasons that I think Trump won. Now, it is easy to say, and I've heard a lot of people saying, well, you know, everybody who voted for Trump is a racist or a sexist or a xenophobe. I don't believe that. I mean, there are some people who do believe it. I don't believe it. Some of those people definitely did vote for Trump, and we're seeing eruptions of that, and we've got to deal with that. But I would say that the majority, probably the strong majority of people who voted for Trump are not racist and they're not sexist. What they responded to is Trump's claim, and this is just how crazy things are. His claim, a multi-billionaire who doesn't pay any taxes, that he is going to take on the establishment. All right? And the way I interpret that, and I'm working hard and I need your help on this issue, is that I don't see this as a victory for Trump as much as I see it as a defeat for the present Democratic Party. A party in... You know, what Democrats were talking about, and rightly so, is they say, look, hey, the economy today, we just had some good statistics come out literally today, lower unemployment. The economy today is better than it was 8 years ago. And Democrats are proud of that, proud of Obama's achievements, and so forth. That's true, and it's fair enough. But there is a major point that many Democrats missed that Mr. Trump did not miss. And that is that while the economy today may be better than it was 8 years ago, the truth is that for the last 40 years, under Democratic and Republican administrations, we have seen a middle class which is shrinking, that today we have 43 million people living in poverty, and that we have more income and wealth inequality today, something that Bob Reich talks about a whole lot, more income and wealth inequality than at any time since 1928. And Trump understood that reality. What Trump was talking to is the fact that median household income, that family right in the middle of our economy today, is earning about $1,400 less than it was in 1999. What he was talking about is that the real median income of a full-time male worker is $2,100 less than it was 43 years ago, adjusted for inflation. Got that? So, full-time male worker, in terms of real inflation adjusted for dollars, earning $2,100 less than 43 years ago, despite the fact that technology has exploded and worker productivity. That worker is producing more, making less. Over the last decade, 81% of all U.S. households saw flat or falling incomes. Over the last 15 years, we have seen the closing in this country of 60,000 factories. Not all of it attributable to trade. Automation played a role, other reasons. But millions of decent-paying jobs have been lost as a result of disastrous trade agreements where large, profitable multinational corporations shut down in the United States and went abroad for cheap labor. There is an issue out there that I think Trump also instinctively understood, and that is the incredible level of despair which exists in many parts of this country. And as I said before, we are a silo-wise society. $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 a year, things are okay. What you may not know is there are places in this country, and I visited some of them. I went to a community called McDowell County in West Virginia. Anybody that come from McDowell County, southern West Virginia? This is a county that used to be a coal mining area where people had decent jobs. What is going on in McDowell County, what is going on in Kentucky, what is going on in many parts of this country is white working class people today are dying at an earlier age than their parents in an ahistorical phenomenon. What life expectancy has always been about is that you live longer than your parents on average. Your parents live longer than their parents, and so forth and so on. And that is true all over the world. And it's true in the African American community, it's true in the Latino community. But in areas of this country, white working class Americans have shorter lives today than their parents. And the reason that most people think that this is occurring is these are people who are working for 10, 11 bucks an hour if they're lucky enough to get jobs. Their kids, in many ways, are going nowhere in a hurry. And they are turning to alcohol, they're turning to opiates and heroin, and they are turning to suicide. So there are parts of this country where the despair is so great. The world has left these people behind. They are not part of their communities. They're not offering anything. They're not being paid anything. And their futures look very bleak. And that type of despair is also what Trump put his finger on. Now, to my mind, I have very little hope that Trump will keep the promises that he made to those people. And we're already seeing, in terms of the appointments or the nominations that he's making to important cabinet positions, people who stand for exactly the opposite of what he campaigned on. He said, we got to stop Wall Street, the power of Wall Street, criticize Hillary Clinton for her ties to Wall Street. Well, guess what? To the surprise of nobody, he just nominated as Treasury Secretary somebody deep in the heart of Wall Street. Trump said, hey, I'm the only Republican candidate. I'm not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And he nominated somebody to become head of Health and Human Services whose main mission in life has been to privatize or cut Medicare. And on it goes. So we are going to expose the hypocrisy of Mr. Trump. We just had a trade situation recently. He campaigned a whole lot about trade and outsourcing. And yet he just reached an agreement with Carrier. He said to the American people that he was going to impose these really very large tariffs You shut down a factory in America, you're going to go to Mexico, man, you're going to pay a hell of a lot to bring that product back into the United States. Well, sits down with the United Technologies people who own Carrier, and he said, here, I'm going to be really tough on you guys. Okay, you can let half of the workers out on the street. You can fire half of them. We're going to go to Mexico. But for the other half, we're going to give you a $7 million tax break. That's how tough he was on United Technologies, a corporation that made $7 billion in profit last year. They don't need any more tax breaks from the American people. And when we talk about what goes on in America, and I have this stuff in the book, but you should appreciate this. And that is, if you live in Fairfax County, Virginia, a wealthy community, if you are a man, you have a life expectancy of 82 years. If you're a woman, you live until you're 85. That's equivalent to what they do in Scandinavia. In McDowell County, the average life expectancy for a man today is 64 years of age. For a woman, 73 years of age. These are communities 6 hours apart by automobile. Our job is to not only expose the hypocrisy of Donald Trump, but it is to revitalize and bring fundamental reforms to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has got to open its doors to working people, to young people, to low-income people. I appreciate very much the time and the money that many upper-income liberals have contributed to the Democratic Party. I appreciate that. But the truth of the matter is the Democratic Party will not succeed by being the party of the liberal elite. It has got to be the party of the working people of this country. So I see our mission now as we go forward, and I mean we, all of us, in reforming the Democratic Party, two major goals. Number one, become an even more diverse party. Bring more women into the party, more African Americans into the party, more Latinos, more people from the LGBT community, more Native Americans, more Asian Americans. We have to do that. But second of all, what we also have to do is create a party where all of us, white, black, and Latino, are very clear that, in fact, we will have the guts to take on Wall Street and the insurance companies and the drug companies and the fossil fuel industry and corporate America. And right now, I am working hard, and I need your help on these things. As we talk about transforming the Democratic Party to make it a grassroots party, your voices have got to be part of that process. Some of you may know a congressman from Minnesota named Keith Ellison. And Keith is already getting beaten up by the establishment. I think Keith would make an excellent chair of the Democratic National Committee. And I think what Keith's mission would be is to recreate the Democratic Party into a party where we don't spend all of our time just raising money from the wealthy, but we spend our time bringing working people and low-income people and people of color together to fight for a nation and a government that works for all of us and not just the 1%. I think the most important task of the new Democratic Party is to think big and not small, to go well beyond what the media and most politicians define as our options. I'm going to be going back to Washington next week, and the choices that I'll face are how much more do we spend on defense, How much do we cut Medicaid? How much do we cut Medicare? How much more do we give in tax breaks to billionaires? Those are not the rational choices that we should be making. The issues that we should be discussing are, why are we the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right? Why do we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs so that 1 out of 5 Americans who gets a prescription from a doctor is unable to afford to fill that prescription? How do we take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry? And let me congratulate the people of California. You've done something very important. I think many of you are familiar with Proposition 61. And this is what you did, and this is no small thing. The pharmaceutical industry made, the top 5 companies last year made $50 billion in profits. They have hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists in Washington and at state capitals all over this country. In this one proposition, whether or not prescription drug costs would be lowered here in California, the pharmaceutical industry, and this is just unbelievable to me, spent $131 million to defeat that proposition, and yet we got 48% of the vote. But those are the questions. Why are we the nation with so much income and wealth inequality? Why are homeless veterans sleeping out on the street when there are those who want to give tax breaks to billionaires? Why do women make 79 cents on the dollar? What are we doing to combat climate change? So our job is to create a Democratic Party which thinks big, not small, which has a vision of where this, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, can go when we stand together. And I think when we bring forth that vision, and when we explain to working people and involve them in the process that, yes, we will take on Wall Street and the other powerful corporate interest, I think we can not only win politically, but I believe we can transform this country into a nation that you and I know that we can become. We can be the leaders in this world in so many ways. Think about a nation in which millions of people here are leading the world, helping to lead the world, transforming our energy system, a new transportation system, new weatherization, new sustainable energies, new innovations to lead the world to protect this planet. Think about the kind of effort that we can mount to provide quality health care as a right to every man, woman, and child. Think about a pharmaceutical industry which is not making billions in profit, but is providing the new drugs that we need to conquer cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. The potential that we have as a nation when we bring people together is just unbelievable. And that is our job. Our job is to understand that today, as we sit here in Berkeley, there are people hurting and very hurting badly all over this country, and we will not turn our backs on those people. So I know that as a result of the election, there are a lot of people who are frightened, who are in despair. But I will tell you this, if you study the history of our country, despair is not an option. It is not an option, not just for you, but for your children and your grandchildren and for the future of this planet. If there's a lesson that must be learned from Trump's victory, is that we must increase our political engagement. We must be involved in all kinds of creative ways in creative ways to bring forth a progressive agenda and to stop Trump's very bad idea. So that's where we are right now. Not a time for despair, a time to remember the struggles that those who went before us engaged in against overwhelming odds. And to remember that today we are involved in a struggle, but when we stand together, when we act intelligently, we can be victorious. Thank you all very much. Okay, and now, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I think so. Oh, there you are. All right. Yes. Now we're going to do some, I think some of you have written out some questions, and John is going to throw them in.
Marion and John, I'm John from Diesel Bookstore. Thank you so much, Senator Sanders. We have a few questions that we gathered at the beginning that people dropped off out front, and one is by an inspired student, as he describes himself or she describes herself. After the primaries and now the general election, many people here in Berkeley went through a mourning period. Can you speak about the processes you went through and how we can bounce back into action like you have?
It is appropriate when you lose to take a day or two off. But let me repeat, in all seriousness, when you deal with issues like bigotry and the incredible hurt that bigotry does to people, when you deal with issues like climate change and understand that if we do not act very, very aggressively today, the kind of planet we leave our kids, I've got 4 kids and 7 beautiful grandchildren, and you have kids and grandchildren, that the planet that we leave those kids will be a much less healthy and habitable planet than the one that we have. You don't have an option of living in remorse or sadness. The only option that you have, the only, to my mind, rational, sensible option that you have is to figure out how we can be most effective in fighting back. And by the way, that's not just rhetoric. Here is a truth. It is as old as America. And that is real change never takes place from the top on down. And I always get annoyed. People say, Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. It is not about Bernie. Boy, I want to break the bad news to you. I don't have all the answers. It is about us, big time. You and me and him and her. It is about all of us coming together. When people come together, we become a power that cannot be resisted. That is just a fact. So when millions of people, Trump may believe whatever he believes about climate change, but when millions of people, when states like California and New York State say, no, sorry, that ain't gonna happen. And our job is to figure out how we can go forward most effectively. What are the tactics? And we're all working on it. I think we're all thinking about that. But I would say that you don't have the time to mourn. You don't have the time to, wonder why. Now is the time, and the whole world depends upon us, our effectiveness in fighting back. That's the message of today.
I've got a question over here. This comes to you from a 13-year-old student here who is admitting to playing hooky today to see you with her mother.
I will write you a note, 13-year-old.
And the question is, in light of all the fake news that's been circulating, we'd like to know, what are your sources for news?
Well, this fake news stuff is a very serious issue. And many millions of people have read during the campaign stuff that was total lies. And we've got to figure out how we deal with that. At the same time, we're not stepping on First Amendment issues. But the more important issue is how we do a much better job in raising political consciousness in this country, and how we do a better job in educating the American people about the reality of what's going on today. In the book, which I guess many of you have bought, go to the, if you get bored in the middle, skip to the last chapter. It's entitled Corporate Media, a Threat to Our Democracy. Okay? And the essence of what that chapter is about is that for a variety of reasons, starting off with the fact that corporate America is owned by large multinational corporations whose job is not to propagate truth or to educate, but to make as much money as they possibly can. That's a fact. And the other fact is that you got about 6 major conglomerates, Time Warner, News Corp, CBS. You got a handful of major media. Comcast is the largest, who control about 90% of the dissemination of information that we get on radio, television, and newspapers. How do we deal with that? And I think there are 2 answers. Number one, we have got to demand that corporate media start talking about the real issues impacting the lives of the American people. Now, I'm not overly optimistic that that will happen, because there are such inbred conflicts of interest. For example, when you see so much advertising on television from the fossil fuel industry or the pharmaceutical industry, the truth is that they're not terribly likely to talk much about why we pay the highest prices in the world for medicine or the dangers of climate change. They're just not going to do that when so much money comes in from these industries. But we do our best. And that's an area where citizens can become heavily involved. You can demand that they start talking about why the middle class in this country is in decline. In the book, it talks about something, and I don't mean to be bragging here, because it's certainly not the case. They talk about, somebody did a study, and they said, it turns out that I think it was the Sunday morning news shows, which are very important, that most of the discussion of poverty during the campaign, a significant percentage of discussion on Sunday morning shows, came from Bernie Sanders. Now, how does it happen when 43 million people are living in poverty that most of the discussion on that issue comes from one candidate? Where is the media talking about the suffering of millions of people today? How come other people are not talking about that issue? All right, so we have got to demand, and another study pointed out that over 90% of media coverage in the campaign did not deal with issues, but dealt with personalities, dealt with emails or people's attitude toward women or whatever. Not to say that those aren't important, but when an average person who's working 50 or 60 hours a week can't afford to send his kid to college, or a single mom can't afford childcare, she would like some discussion of the issues relevant to her life. But you can watch television for decades and not see that. All right, but the second thing is, and the internet opens up this opportunity, is how do we communicate effectively with millions and millions of people? How do we talk about the role of money in politics? So I think that is an area that we also have got to focus on, is how we make sure that the internet works as a means not for fake news, but to get good information out to people who today are simply, there are states out there where all you hear is Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity. Okay, in fact, another issue that we have got to be dealing with is how does it happen and that in this country, which is split politically, over 90% of talk radio is extreme right wing? How does that happen? How does it happen that in cities in America where the Republicans get 25% of the vote, you can't find a progressive radio talk show? So when we talk about getting involved in the political process, figure out a way that you can demand corporate media to talk about the real issues, that you can demand that radio stations in your community start allowing progressive voices to be heard. Figure out a way that we better use the internet to get ideas out to people who have not been exposed to those ideas. A lot of work to be done in that regard.
Both you and Trump are seen as outsiders, and that's why a lot of people gravitated to you both. What are the chances of having a true third party?
That's a good question. You know, you are looking at the longest serving independent in the history of the United States Congress, okay? So, you know, I have some familiarity with this issue. When I was elected mayor of Burlington, I defeated a Democratic incumbent. And over the years, we run for Congress against Democrats and Republicans, run for mayor against Democrats and Republicans. So I know a little bit about the issue. You know, in Vermont, in fact, we now have a pretty strong progressive party, which just elected, by the way, a lieutenant governor. Lieutenant governor of the state of Vermont will be the most progressive lieutenant governor, I believe, in the United States of America. Okay, so we have 3 people in the state Senate out of 30. So in Vermont, we have made some progress. And I think, you know, politics is an art and not a science. And I think you got to look at the situation that you are in. Right now, the choice that I have made is that I will do everything that I can. And I've recently been made a part of the Democratic leadership. So, and the responsibility that I have been given is outreach. And my job, and I need help on this, let me tell you, because nobody knows how to do this. Certainly it has not been done. How do you create a broad-based, diverse political party? How do we create a mechanism by which the chair, I would say 98% of the American people have no clue who the chairs, their state chair of the Democratic or Republican Party. How do we create a vibrant party where people are feeling good, are actively involved, are talking about the issues, are demanding their elected officials get involved in those issues? Nobody knows how to do that. It's never happened. I'm trying to do it, and I'd love to have your ideas and your help. But the end of the day is if we can bring millions and millions of people in there and say, you know what, this is my party, and we are going to fight for working families. We're going to fight to create much better educational opportunities. We're taking on climate change. We're going to go for a Medicare for all single-payer program. If we bring people into the party, we can transform America. And I need your help to do that. So get involved locally, get involved at the statewide level. That's where I am focusing right now.
So, what are the chances we can get rid of the Electoral College anytime soon?
Okay, good question. All right, these are really great questions. I don't know what the chances are, but let's just look at the facts. 2 important considerations. Number 1, Hillary Clinton ended up with over 2 million more votes than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to be inaugurated. Something is not right in that picture, right? We all grew up believing that majority wins. The person who gets the most votes wins. In this case, Clinton got the most votes, but she's not going to be inaugurated. That, on the surface, seems to be unacceptable. Second area, and maybe I speak just as somebody who gets involved, you know, and works hard in politics, and in California, you will appreciate this. The way the nature of the Electoral College right now is, everybody knows that the state of California is a strongly Democratic state. The state of Vermont is a strongly Democratic state. The state of Wyoming is a strongly Republican state. Mississippi is a Republican state. So what ends up happening is when candidates run for president, they focus on 17 or 18 battleground states. So they spend a lot of time in Michigan and Ohio and Florida. They don't spend a lot of time in California or Vermont, for that matter, or Wyoming. So the needs of the people of those states really don't get paid a whole lot of attention to. So to answer your question, I think we need a serious discussion about how we address that issue. Clearly, the status quo is not working, is wrong.
How do we get people to understand that they're voting against their best interests? And what can I do to help the disenfranchised to realize they can make a difference?
I think again, I think this issue comes back to the weakness of the Democratic Party. If the Democratic Party had in fact raised the minimum wage to a living wage, if the Democratic Party had provided and passed legislation for health care for all, if the Democratic Party had in fact passed pay equity for women, if the Democratic Party had put many billions of dollars into rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and creating millions of jobs, if the Democratic Party had led the effort in terms of criminal justice reform or in terms of immigration reform, people would know which party was fighting for them. But the truth is the Democratic Party has not done that. They do better than the Republican Party, to be sure. But it is not good enough for a major political party to say, vote for me, because these guys are much worse than I am. That is not an agenda that you can run on. So, you know, what I think is that, and where my mind is right now, and again, we just got this assignment a week or two ago, and we're trying to figure out how best to do it. No, because it has never really been done before. How do you create a real, with a small d, Democratic Party where the ideas and needs of people filter on up to the elected officials and where the elected officials are held accountable by the people? All right? All right, so we're working on that, and we need your help. So maybe that's all I'll say on that one. Yeah. All right, I'm getting dizzy. Who's going?
Okay.
All right. Mary.
I got a million of them.
All right.
Are you worried that any bipartisan, in quotes, cooperation with Trump will lend legitimacy to his politics of hate?
That's a very good question. And as I indicated, I mean, the way I see it, and people can disagree with me, the way I see it is, and I started my remarks off by saying that no, there can be no compromise on bigotry. There can be no compromise on climate change. There can be no compromise on protecting American democracy. But if Trump comes up, Trump campaigned on the need to rebuild our infrastructure. Well, our infrastructure is crumbling. Now, the proposal that he hasn't come up with a defined plan yet, seems to me a pretty dumb one. It's giving tax breaks to large corporations and privatizing the infrastructure, something you might expect from right-wing Republicans. But if, in fact, a compromise can be worked out, in which, in fact, we have a decent plan to rebuild our infrastructure and create millions of jobs, yeah, I think that is something that we can work with him on. I think that in terms of trade policy, you know, it turns out that he's backing away from what he said. But by the way, I don't know, everybody here may not agree, but one of the victories that the progressive movement has made in the last year is the defeat of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. So how do we, and this is something that Trump, talked about a lot, how do we create a trade policy in which corporate America reinvests in this country, creates decent paying jobs in this country? How do we rebuild our manufacturing base? How do we make sure that when people lose their jobs because of automation or whatever, they're not simply thrown out on the street? Trump talked about new trade policies if he comes up with something that's halfway decent. Now, he's already backed off of that. But again, we will hold him accountable. And if he can come up with something that makes sense, I think we should work with him. But I think on the basic fundamental issues of bigotry, of climate change, of democracy, no, there cannot be any compromise.
This is the last question. Sorry. Automation caused unemployment seems more of an issue than TPP. What do you think should be done to make it possible to learn a living that is a basic income?
Good. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of questions which need discussion, which get virtually no discussion at all. And this requires us to think big and not small. Technology should be a positive. There is nothing wonderful about working in a factory 50 or 60 hours a week. Nothing great about it. But it is better than being unemployed. So the question is, how does it happen that with an explosion of technology and an increase in worker productivity, so many working people have lost their jobs? So to answer your question speaks to about creating a very different type of America. An America that starts off with the premise that every one of our people, men, women, and children, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, will have a decent standard of living. And if some robot comes along to take your job, we should see that as a positive thing, not a negative thing. If you're working 30 hours a week rather than 60 hours a week, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But you need the income to take care of your family. We cannot continue to live in a society where technology and greed rule. Hey, sorry, we got a new machine, you lose your job, you're out on the street. No, we got a new machine. You have to work less hours, but of course you're going to continue to get the income you need to take care of your family. I mean, but that really does require a political revolution. When I talk in the book, and I talk about, every day about a political revolution, what it means is there is no defined revolution. You are the revolutionaries. It means the questions like that are exactly the difficult questions, not easy stuff that we have got to tackle. But I think it gets back to something that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talked about, which got no attention at all. Actually, Michael Moore picked up on it. I don't know if any of you saw that. Michael put it in, I don't know where it was, one of his last films or something. He had a film of FDR talking about a second Bill of Rights. Any of you familiar with that?
Yes.
All right. And what the second Bill of Rights was about is not just the first Bill of Rights is protecting our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, all of that stuff, good stuff. The second Bill of Rights talks about economic rights. It says that people in a democratic, civilized society are entitled as a right to have a job. It talks about the right to health care, the right to good education. Now, the difference between us and the right-wing people is they believe in a market economy where if your goal is to make as much money as you possibly can, and in the last 15 years, we've seen a tenfold increase in billionaires. And they can make as much money as they can. If you have nothing, tough luck. You don't have any health care, you're old, you don't have enough money to live on, you're a baby, not getting enough food, that doesn't matter. That's not their concern. All right? But our job, I think, is to fight for, in fact, that concept of human rights. Health care is a right. A decent job is a right. Protecting the environment is a human right. Ending bigotry is a human right. All right? And that's what our struggle is about. And these are not going to be easy. People in this room will disagree. Open it up. Well, I think this, I think that. That's fine. We've got to learn how to work with each other. But I think on all of those issues, as I said at the very beginning of my remarks, you will find the vast majority of the American people supporting our agenda. Don't ever forget that. So we've got a lot of work to do in the weeks and months and years to come. We got a lot of work to do it. Let's go forward together. Thank you all very much. Please do never forget that Mr. Trump got 2 million votes less than Secretary Clinton on Election Day. And the importance of that is that you have got to understand in your hearts, and we will make Mr. Trump understand, he does not have a mandate, period. Second of all, and this is important and and something that we have to think a whole lot about and we've got to understand. But the truth is that on virtually every major issue facing this country, the majority of the American people support the progressive position. So I don't want anybody here to think that you are a member of some fringe minority. Virtually every view that you hold is a majority view in this country. Vast majority of the American people want to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And by the way, wherever I go around the country, I always mention Seattle as having gone first in raising the minimum wage. And the importance of that, and I speak as a former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, is that when you act locally, when you passed a $15 an hour minimum wage, suddenly California began looking at it, and San Francisco, and New York State, and communities all over the country. Acting locally and progressively is certainly a part of what the political revolution is about. Thank you, Seattle. But it's not just the minimum wage. It is pay equity for women. Overwhelmingly, the American people say that it is absurd that in the year 2016, women are making 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. The American people overwhelmingly understand that when our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our rail system, our levees, our dams, our water systems, our wastewater plants are collapsing, they understand that when we invest in our infrastructure, we improve the quality of our lives and we create millions of good-paying jobs. That is what the American people believe. The American people believe, from childcare to graduate school, we need radical changes in the way we fund education in this country. Now, it is not a sexy issue. It's not an issue that gets talked about a whole lot. But the truth is that throughout this country, our child care system is dysfunctional. Right now, just think about it for a moment. 2 points. Every psychologist who studies human behavior, human development, understands that 0 through 5 are the most important years of human development, emotionally and intellectually. And yet what we have right now are child care workers earning an average wage of less than $10 an hour, not having the training that they need to provide the quality child care that parents deserve. Meanwhile, you got working moms, single moms paying $10,000, $15,000 a year for child care. Our job as a nation is to understand that those little kids are the future of this country. We're going to invest in the best child care that we can for them. And that is what the American people want also. And they also know that in a highly competitive global economy, we need the best educated workforce in the world. Truth is, 30, 40 years ago, we had more people going to college and graduating college than any other country on earth. Today, that is no longer the case. Many, many countries now have a higher percentage of college graduates than we do. Our job is to make public colleges and universities tuition-free so that any kid and we have also got to deal, what we are trying to do, what this book is about, is demanding that people think big, not small, not accept the minimal choices that Washington or the media often gives us. if we want the best educated workforce in the world, if we want our people to be getting as much education as they need, millions of people should not be forced to leave college or graduate school deeply in debt. And that's not just me or you. That is what the American people believe. And I'll tell you what else the American people believe. They believe that billionaires like Donald Trump, they believe that large multinational corporations should start paying their fair share of taxes. And there are some people who think that the solution to immigration problems we have today is to swoop up on a given night, I suppose, and throw millions of people out of this country. That is not going to happen, and that is not what the American people want. What they want is comprehensive immigration reform and a path toward citizenship. And I'll tell you something else that the American people, even conservatives, understand this issue, and that is it makes no sense at all that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, which is what we are today, we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. China is 4 times our size. Think about it. 4 times our size. Communist, authoritarian country does not tolerate dissent terribly well. We've got far more people in jail per capita and totally than China does. And what the American people understand is that when we are spending $80 billion a year to lock up people at the local, state, and federal level, it pays a hell of a lot, makes a hell of a lot more sense to be investing in jobs and education rather than jails or incarceration. In my small state of Vermont and in states throughout this country, we spend more money on locking people up than we do on higher education. That is nuts. What the American people also understand is that we have got to radically reform a broken campaign finance system. Now, one of the issues that I worry about, and I worry about a lot with Mr. Trump going to the White House, but one of the areas that I worry about the most is the threat to basic democratic values in this country. And this is what I worry about. I worry about 2 things that the Republicans are trying to do. Number one, Republicans love Citizens United, which in my view is the worst Supreme Court decision in the modern history of this country. Now, what Citizens United does and how it undermines democracy, as many of you know, is what it says to billionaires like the Koch brothers or large corporations. It says you can spend as much money as you want on an election, hundreds of millions of dollars, but it has to be an independent expenditure. And what that means is when you turn on your TV and during an election, what you'll see is phony groups, citizens for this, citizens for that, running negative ads. Those are independent expenditures often funded by billionaires or large corporations. For the Republican leadership in Congress, if you can believe it, Citizens United does not go far enough. What they want to do is end all campaign finance limitations and allow billionaires to directly fund candidates. What that means in English is they will select somebody to run for the Senate from the state of Washington and say, here is a check for $100 million. There is your campaign manager. There is your speechwriter. There is your media consultant. You now work for me. You are on my payroll. That is what the Republican leadership wants. Our job is exactly the opposite. Our job is to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, move to a one-person, one-vote democracy, not have billionaires buying elections. But there is another issue equally important and of equal concern. You may have noticed the other day that Trump sent out a totally absurd tweet. Now, we're getting used to having government by tweet, 140 characters or less. And this particular tweet was really delusional. I mean, it is really unbelievable that we have a guy who's going to be president sending this out. He says he would have won the popular vote if millions of people had not voted illegally. Nobody who studies the issue believes that that statement makes any sense at all. It is totally nuts. All right? Voter fraud is a very serious problem if somebody commits it. The good news is that in America we have very little voter fraud. Our Republican friends search high and low all over this country to find cases of voter fraud, and very rarely do they find any. But what Trump's tweet was really about, if you go beneath the surface, what he was saying to Republican leaders, become aggressive in terms of voter suppression. Make it harder for people to vote. Make it harder for immigrants to vote. Make it harder for people of color to vote. Young people, old people. People who might vote against us, put obstacles in their way, put impediments in their way so they cannot participate in the political process. What an insult that is to the millions of men and women who put their lives on the line and sometimes died for what makes us a great country, and that is our democracy. Our job, and states around the country are moving forward in this area, is to figure out ways that we can involve more people in the political process, not fewer people. At the end of the day, what some, and I don't want to suggest all Republicans because that would not be accurate, but what some want is democracy, meaning that billionaires buy elections and poor people and working people are kept from voting. And that is something we are going to fight tooth and nail. That is not our definition of democracy. Now, Trump said many, many absurd things during his campaign, but at the heart of that entire campaign, the cornerstone of his campaign was bigotry. It was an attempt to divide the American people up, to have one group of people hate another group of people. All of you know that before Mr. Trump became a candidate for president, he was the leader of the so-called birther movement. And the birther movement was a racist effort to undermine the legitimacy of the first African-American president in our history. That's what it was. In the beginning of his campaign, one of the very first things he did was to attack Mexicans and call them criminals and racists. The things that he said about women, I cannot repeat from this podium because they would embarrass you and they would embarrass me. But the ugly statements that he made about women is beyond belief. Right now, his view is, or maybe he's modifying it, is that people of one of the largest religions in the world, Muslims, should not be able to visit our country or come to our country. Our job in understanding the long and painful history we as a nation have had in combating discrimination is that we will not compromise on the issue of bigotry. No compromise there. All of you know, there are some rock solid values that we just cannot compromise. All of you are aware that before this country even became a country, when the first settlers came here, and the lies and the cheating and the refusal to honor treaties with Native Americans, a practice which is going on today at Standing Rock. I know that. But not only the horrific treatment of Native Americans, we all know about the abomination of slavery and Jim Crow activities and the fight to get the vote for people regardless of their color. We all know that 100 years ago tonight, women were not running for president of the United States. They did not have the right to vote. They did not have the right to get the education they wanted, do the work they wanted. We all know the suffering and the pain and the humiliation that our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community went through year after year. We know the kinds of blatant discrimination that took place against the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, Catholics. That is the history of this country. And for 200 years, incredibly brave and decent people struggled against that bigotry. And we have made good progress in that struggle. We have a long way to go, but we should be proud of the progress we have made. If we were here 20 years ago and somebody jumped up and said, Bernie, I think by the year 2008 we'll elect an African American as president of the United States. Or by the year 2015, gay marriage will be legal in 50 states in this country, people would have thought that that was nuts, could not happen. But it happened because of the struggles of millions and millions of people. And what we say to Mr. Trump, we have traveled too far in the fight against discrimination. We are not going backwards. Thank you. And there is another area where we cannot compromise. Mr. Trump ran his entire campaign by proclaiming that climate change is a hoax, emanating from China. And I will never understand why he thought it was China. One would have thought he thought it was Mexico maybe, or one of the Muslim countries, but it was China. Now, what Mr. Trump has got to understand is that the scientific community is virtually united in telling us that climate change is not a hoax. It is the most serious environmental crisis facing not just the United States, obviously, but the entire world. And what the scientists are telling us in really plain, straightforward language is if we do not get our act together as a planet and transform our energy systems away from fossil fuel into energy efficiency and sustainable energy, the planet that we will be leaving our kids, our grandchildren, and future generations will become less and less healthy, less and less habitable. So what our message is, and it has to be delivered by millions of people in all kinds of ways, is that we will stand up to the fossil fuel industry who believe that their short-term profits are more important than the future of our planets. We will stand up to them and anybody else, because this is not just a fight for us. Far more significantly, it is a fight for our kids, our grandchildren, and future generations. We are custodians of this planet, and we have a moral responsibility to protect this planet. Now, there are a lot of people who say, how in God's name did Donald Trump win? I don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump. And then there are other people who are saying, how did Hillary Clinton get 2 million more votes than Trump? I don't know anybody who voted for Hillary Clinton. And what that is about, in many ways, and it's an area that we have got to work on, is that we live in a silo-wise, I don't know if that's the kosher word here, but we live in our own worlds. People here live in a world, and they live in a world, and everyone talks to each other, they all agree on everything. But I want to tell you, in my view, why I believe that Trump won. Number one, I do not accept what some people say. Everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a racist or a sexist or a homophobe. I don't believe that. Some of them are, absolutely. But I don't believe that that is the majority of those people. I think what Trump did in a brilliant way, even though it was totally hypocritical and dishonest, is what he did is he spoke to the pain and anxiety that millions of people today are feeling. And when he got up there and he said, I, Donald Trump, I am prepared to take on the establishment, the political establishment, the economic establishment, the media establishment. A lot of people said, well, I don't like him on this and I don't believe him on that, and his views on women are terrible. But you know what? We do need to shake the system up. We do need to take on the establishment. And many of those people, holding their noses with reluctance, ended up voting for him. And I'll tell you what he also spoke to, and what the media does an abysmal job in reporting. And by the way, in this book, if you get bored halfway through, skip to the last chapter. Now, it's actually a good book, but just in case, if tax policy is not your thing, go to the last chapter, which is called Corporate Media, a Threat to Our Democracy. And essentially what that chapter talks about is that there are enormous problems facing our country. There are tens of millions of people tonight living in pain, living in anxiety. They don't know how they're going to pay the electric bill. They don't know how they're going to put gas in their car to get to work, and if they can't get to work, they're going to get fired, and if they get fired, they don't know what's going to happen to their kids. You got moms out there who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year and paying $10,000, $15,000 a year in child care. They don't know how they are going to do that. We have 28 million people in this country who have no health insurance. Do you know what it's like not to have any health insurance? Do you know what it's like to have a high deductible and a high copayment so that when you get sick, you cannot go to the doctor? Do you know that there are thousands of people who die every single year in this, the richest country in the history of the world? They die because they don't go to the doctor when they should. And I've talked to doctors in my state, all over this country, and they tell me about people who come in who are incredibly sick. And they say, why didn't you come in here a year ago when your symptoms first developed? And the person sheepishly says, well, I don't have any insurance. My deductible is too high, I can't afford it. Some of those people do not make it when they should have been able to be treated effectively. Some end up in the hospital with great suffering and great expense. You got 28 million uninsured, more than that underinsured. Right now in America, you can go to the doctor when you're sick. Doctor writes out a prescription. 1 out of 5 Americans today cannot afford to fill that prescription because the pharmaceutical industry is ripping us off and charging us the highest prices in the world. So how do you feel about the political establishment? How do you feel about the political parties? You go to the doctor when you're sick, you can't even afford to fill a prescription. How do you feel about the system when you're out there making 12, 13 bucks an hour? And you can do the arithmetic as well as I can. Millions of people out there working for substandard wages, working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, not making enough money to take care of themselves, let alone their kids. How do you feel? And this is what Trump was doing. He was talking to these people. Today in America, there are millions of older workers, people who are 55 or 60, people who are approaching retirement. Half of the older workers in this country have $0 in savings. You're 60 years of age, you're running out of steam, you're getting sicker, you're tired. You're going to be retired in 5 years, you got nothing in the bank. And you know what? People are scared. They are scared of what happens to them after they stop working. And many of those people were once working at decent jobs in factories, and then one day their employer came up and said, oh, by the way, thank you for your 20 years of service, but we're shutting you down and we're moving to Mexico and we're moving to China. And those people, if they had a union, if they were making decent wages, suddenly found themselves out on the street earning 50, 60% of what they made when they had a decent job. During the course of the campaign, Jane and I went to a county in southern West Virginia. It's called McDowell County. It is a former coal mining area. And today, something ahistorical, unprecedented is happening in McDowell County, in many other areas of West Virginia, Kentucky, and other parts of this country. Throughout the modern history of this country, and in fact the world, what we have seen is that people's life expectancy goes up. Everything being equal, I live longer than my parents did, my parents live longer than their parents, and so forth and so on. That's going on all over the world as a result of medical, improved medicine, drugs, and so forth. Yet, for millions today of white working class people, their life expectancy is now lower than their parents. What is going on in communities all across this country is the despair, the hopelessness is so high that people are turning to opiates, they're turning to heroin, they're turning to alcohol, they are turning to suicide in very large numbers, so that we have now many millions of people whose life expectancy is lower than their parents. This is the despair that exists in certain parts of our country. But it's not just the white working class. You go to large urban cities, and you go to African American communities, and you see youth unemployment in those communities of 20, 30, 40%. Latino communities, the same. And when kids have no jobs and they have no education, we should not be surprised that we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. That is what is going on in America. You don't see it on CBS, and you're not going to see it on CNN. But Trump saw it, and he was right. Our job is to rebuild a Democratic Party, to make certain that it is the Democratic Party that honestly brings those people and their concerns into the political process, because Donald Trump is not. You can see it every day. Every day, the hypocrisy of his campaign. Just the other day, he said, in one of his tweets or something, he said, I am the only Republican candidate who will not cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Well, he just appointed a congressman, Mr. Price, whose life's goal is to end public health care. All right? Mr. Trump told the American people he was going to take on Wall Street. Wall Street's not going to rip off the American people. And yet the guy we think he is going to appoint as Secretary of Treasury comes from Goldman Sachs once again. All right. He is not going to represent working people. Our job is. Now, what we need to do, and what I am working on very hard right now, I've been made a, for better or worse, part of the Democratic leadership in the Senate. And the job that I have been given is to be chair of the outreach effort. So that means I need your help. And that means what we have got to do at this particular moment. This is a very unique and unusual moment in American history. And we have got to take where we are and turn it around. And I think the way we turn it around is to understand that now, more than any time in our lifetimes, it is absolutely imperative that we become involved in every sense of the word, in every way that we can in the political process. All right? Politics is not just about voting every 2 years or every 4 years. That's obviously very important. But politics really is 365 days a year. How does the state of Washington help lead the country in terms of climate change? What kind of actions? How do we go forward to join the rest of the industrialized world in guaranteeing health care to all people as a right? How do we effectively take on the pharmaceutical industry and demand that they lower their outrageously high prices? How do we make sure that our children and our seniors and our disabled veterans get the kind of support that they need to live in dignity? And each and every one of you has got to think about how we go forward. It's not going to be Washington. It's not even going to be just the progressives in Washington who can do it. We can't do it without your support. And with your support, we can do it. At the end of the day, and I think it's important for all of us to reflect upon this, this country has gone through, over its history, just some enormous, enormous crises. And people by the millions have struggled to create more justice, more equality, more dignity. Think about what people had to go through in the past. Think about the workers who had to go out on strike, and Seattle had one of the great strikes in the history of the labor movement, as a matter of fact. Think about what workers had to do to form unions so they can engage in collective bargaining, what they had to do to make sure that kids were not working in factories. Think about the struggle of the civil rights movement. During the course of the campaign, Jane and I were in Birmingham, Alabama, and I learned something that I did not know. I remembered, and I think most of you, the terrible bombing that took place in Birmingham that killed 4 beautiful children. What most people don't know, I did not know, is during that month in Birmingham, there were 13 bombings in 1 month in order to intimidate the African American community who were fighting for voting rights. They stood tall, they continued the struggle, and they won. So our job is not to throw up our hands in despair. Our job is not to say we're tired or we're angry. Our job is to use our brains to think about the most effective way that we can fight back. And when we do that, we're going to win this thing. Let me say a a few words about the book, given the fact that we're here for the book. I thought I would mention the book. The book is divided into two parts. The first part basically says how did we start this campaign? Well, we started the campaign with a handful of people. We had no money, no political organization. We had no name recognition, or very little. And we were taking on the entire Democratic establishment, virtually every member of the Senate, every member of the House, every governor in America, every mayor in America. Other than that, we had a lot of support from the establishment. And that's where we started, with nothing. But it turned out that the American people were, in fact, sick and tired of establishment politics and establishment economics. And it turned out that the American people wanted real change. That was true then, it is true now. And what we ended up with is taking on the political establishment, taking on the Clinton organization, which was the most powerful political organization in the country, having elected Bill Clinton twice and almost electing Hillary in 2008. We took them on. But we ended up, after all of that and more, with winning 22 states, including the great state of Washington. Winning 46% of the pledged delegates. Winning almost none of the superdelegates. And raising just a large amount of money from average contributions of $27, okay? And most importantly, is in every state in the country, we won the votes of young people, and I mean not just 20 years of age or younger, but 40 or younger. We won the overwhelming support of white young people, Black young people, Latino young people, Native American young people, Asian American young people. And what that is about, and I want everybody here to fully appreciate it and be proud of that. That is the future of America, and that future is on our side. Now, what I do in the second part of the book is not, I think, done enough in this country, and that is lay out the issues, and I'll briefly go over them, and then provide concrete solutions. And first chapter that I have, which is, in fact, the issue that concerns me the most, is how do we defeat oligarchy? Now, you can't defeat oligarchy unless you recognize oligarchy. And most certainly this is not a word that will appear on television. And that's another issue. And that's a serious problem. But the truth is that today, both economically and politically, we are moving toward a society in which a small number of billionaires have incredible control over our economy and increasingly over our political life. You know, when we were kids, we used to read textbooks about small countries around the world controlled by a few families. I don't want to be the first to break the bad news to you. Take a look at what's going on in this country today. Take a look at what goes on Wall Street, where you have a half a dozen major financial institutions who have assets equivalent to 58% of the GDP of the United States of America, about $10 trillion. They write about 2/3 of the credit cards, 1/3 of the mortgages. Unbelievable power. And yet, the business model of Wall Street is fraud. And despite the fact that we don't have a particularly strong enforcement mechanism in Washington, every single one of these major financial institutions, Goldman Sachs and all the rest, have paid billions of dollars in fines for illegal behavior. That is the most powerful economic institution in America, running on fraud. And yet when we talk about a broken criminal justice system, we talk about kids getting criminal records for smoking marijuana, but not one executive on Wall Street has been prosecuted. And the second chapter deals again with something that needs a lot of discussion. Democrats, appropriately so, take pride. And they say, look, we're better off today than we were 8 years ago just before Obama came into office. We've made progress. And the evidence is overwhelming that that is true. Unemployment much less, wages higher. And we should be proud of that. But here is another reality, and Trump picked up on this. For 40 years, the middle class of this country has been in decline. In the United States today, median household income is $1,400 less than it was in 1999. The real median income of full-time male workers is $2,100 less than it was 43 years ago. Over the last 15 years, we have lost some 60,000 factories in this country and millions of decent paying jobs. Over the last decade, 81% of American households saw flat or falling incomes. That is what Trump was talking about. That is why people are angry. And our question that we have got to ask ourselves is, how does it happen that the middle class continues to shrink? People work longer hours, in many cases for lower wages, while 52% of all new income today goes to the top 1%. How does it happen that in the last 16 years we have seen a 10-fold increase in the number of billionaires in America? 10 increase from 51 to 540 billionaires, a few of them here in Seattle. And yet we have seen a continuation of America having the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country. Those are issues we have got to deal with. And what we're talking about here in the book is, how do you create an economy which works for all of us and not just the 1%? Next chapter deals with healthcare, and it answers a very simple question. Again, a question, it does not appear on CBS or NBC. It doesn't happen. How does it happen that we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee healthcare to all people as a right? You are 2 hours away from the Canadian border. On the other side of the country, I live 50 miles away from the Canadian border. For 30 years or so, they have managed through a single-payer healthcare system to guarantee healthcare to all of their people. They spend significantly less per capita. So this chapter basically discusses why we remain the only major country that doesn't guarantee healthcare to all, what it would mean, what a radical, revolutionary transformation of our society if everybody had health care as a right. You know what amount of anxiety that would be lifted from the shoulders of millions of people when they get sick? They could actually go to the doctor. That you don't have to stay in a job that you hate just because you get good health care. You go out, start your own business, and not worry whether your family is covered. You can afford the prescription drugs that your doctor prescribes. This will radically transform America. This chapter talks about how we move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program. There is a chapter, and I discussed this already, about climate change and why it is that we have not moved aggressively as we should in transforming our energy system. It talks about the power of the fossil fuel industry, about the lies that they spew, the phony organizations that they establish in order to try to confuse people about the reality of climate change. This book talks about real criminal justice reform and the need to end this international embarrassment of having more people in jail than any other country, having very high rates of recidivism. When we were in Iowa, we held a forum on criminal justice. I'll never forget this. And we had a couple of guys up there who had served time. And one guy said, yeah, I remember when I got out, they came to me, he was in jail in Iowa, and they came to me the day before I was to be released, and they said, you're getting out tomorrow. Here is a check for $75, and good luck to you. He ended up back in jail. We have a very high rate of recidivism because we put people out on the streets without the education, without the job training, without the housing that they need in order to escape from the environment that got them in jail in the first place. So, and the book talks about, again, an issue that is not widely talked about. And that is not only the fact that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, it's that so many of our seniors and disabled veterans and people with disabilities are really, really struggling just to survive. It is right. And right now, I know in Seattle and in Burlington, Vermont, there are people trying to get by, older people trying to get by on $10,000, $12,000, $13,000 a year Social Security. And you can do the arithmetic as well as I can. The truth is you can't get by. Those people are cutting their prescription drugs in half. They're not adequately heating their homes. They're not eating the way they should. Many of them become depressed. We as a nation have got to understand that a great nation is not judged by the number of billionaires that it has. We are judged by how we treat the most vulnerable people in our country. So there's a lot of good information in the book, and some of it just talks about going around the country and meeting people, and things that, one never forgets. We were in Phoenix, Arizona, and meeting with young Latino kids and teenagers, maybe a little bit older, and tears were streaming down their eyes as they talked about their fear, their very palpable fear of going home from school one day and finding their mom or their dad deported. So the book, I think, addresses many of the major problems that our country faces, but it also talks about how we can solve them and where we can go as a nation. And let me just conclude by saying what I said before. We are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. If we were a poor nation, and we talked about providing good quality health care to all, it would be unrealistic. How do you get the doctors? How do you get the nurses? How do you get the medicine? We're not. We're a rich country. If we were a poor country, it would be very idealistic to talk about making public colleges and universities tuition-free and allowing anybody who has the ability to get a higher education. But we're not a poor country. We are the richest country in the history of the world. And what it comes down to, and where I need your help, where this country needs all of your help, is we have got to understand that we can accomplish extraordinary things in terms of healthcare, education, infrastructure, criminal justice, etc., if we have the courage to take on the greed of the billionaire class. Now, I know that makes some people uncomfortable. I know it makes some people uncomfortable, but I think we have to think about it. These guys up there, they're around Washington all of the time. I've seen billionaires, heads of large corporations, and they come into Washington, D.C., and they get golden parachutes of millions of dollars, retirement benefits, living in luxury for the rest of their lives, and they come to Washington and they say, cut Social Security, cut Medicare. That's what I see. That's what I hear. So what we have got to do is to understand why things are happening the way they are. It's not just good enough to say, well, we're concerned about the homeless. Yeah, of course we are. We're concerned about people in jail. Of course we are. We have got to figure out why things are happening. And a lot of that has to do with the greed of a billionaire class of CEOs today of large corporations who make 300 times more than their workers, who could care less about shutting down a plant in the state of Washington or the state of Vermont and moving to China, moving to Mexico, if they can make $5 more in profit. They could care less. And that's the reality that we have to deal with. They are very powerful politically. They are powerful economically. But we have something that they don't have. And that is, there may be 500 billionaires in this country, but there are 320 million ordinary citizens. So, with that, let me open it up for questions. I think somebody's going to come up here, and here she comes.
Okay.
All right, fire away.
How can Bernie supporters reconcile differences with Trump supporters to benefit both?
Let me hear I heard read that question again, please.
Okay. How can Bernie supporters
Yeah.
reconcile differences with Trump supporters to benefit others?
Good.
To benefit both, sorry. To benefit both.
Go to, if you have friends who voted for Mr. Trump, ask them whether they think it is a good idea to cut Social Security and Medicare and give tax breaks to billionaires. Vast majority will tell you what you think, and that is an absurd idea. Ask Trump supporters whether they would like to be able to send their kids to college without their kids being $50,000 or $100,000 in debt. And they will tell you, yes, they would like to be able to send their kids to college. Ask Trump supporters whether they'd like to live in affordable housing. Ask Trump supporters whether or not they would like to be having health care that they can afford. On many, many issues, you're going to see Trump supporters holding views not radically dissimilar than we hold. But you are also going to see, and we're doing this every day, go to my website and you'll see it, we are going to expose the hypocrisy of Trump, because I may be wrong on this, maybe I'm wrong. He's a complicated guy, but I happen to believe that he doesn't really mean anything that he has said. And I think Trump supporters are going to see that soon enough. And I may give you an example. Guy who told people, they're elderly people who voted for Trump after he said, I'm not going to cut your Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, just appointed the other day a guy who wants to do just that. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they're going to cut Social Security. We will wait and see. But it very well and likely will be, they will make that effort, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is a way to reach out to Trump supporters.
Okay. How can we build safer communities for minorities?
Well, that is and I would add to minorities, I would add immigrants as well. One of the immediate concerns, and we'll see again, Trump, you know, I hate to say this because I am not the most, it's hard for you to believe, but it's true. I'm not the most partisan guy in the world. I've never run negative ads. I don't like attacking, you know, people because they disagree with me. It's not my style. But Trump puts you in a very difficult position, as he does the media who covers him, because he lies all of the time. And it's not just me. It's not, you know, he is, you know, just the statement that he made the other day, millions of people voted illegally. It is a totally ridiculous statement, et cetera, et cetera. I worry, and we have to be organized to deal with this. If it is his goal to destroy whole lots of families by deporting people who have been in this country, who have worked in this country, who are working today, who are raising their kids, We have to defend those people. And we can figure out how we do it, but good communities can stand by those people, and we can and will defend them. And if we do that, he will not be able to get away with what he is proposing. And in terms of minorities, it is, look, when we have 20, 30, 40% youth unemployment, that is unacceptable. When such a high percentage, something like 1 out of 4, if we do not change it, and I hesitate to say this because I want to change it, but 1 out of 4 African-American males born today will end up in jail unless we change the nature of our economy, our educational system, and our criminal justice system. So there's a lot that has to be done. One of the areas I think we got to work on, and there's a lot of work being done on it already, is the so-called war on drugs. A lot of, we got two problems. This opiate thing, heroin thing is a terrible, terrible problem. We've got to figure out how we deal with that. But on the other hand, we have to understand that a lot of lives have been damaged. People get criminal records for smoking marijuana. When you get a criminal record, it's hard to go out and get a job. And when you look at it from a racial perspective, blacks and whites, it turns out, according to studies, smoke marijuana at about equal levels. Blacks are 4 times more likely to get arrested than whites. So, those are issues that we just are going to have to deal with.
Okay. How do we remain positive? Good question.
I think we remain positive by looking at the moment we're in from an historical perspective, and not just today. And you look at the incredible crises and tragedies and pain that this country and every country have gone through throughout our history. And I mentioned before, just 50, 60 years ago, you're an African-American mother in the state of Mississippi trying to explain to your daughter why she can't go to the school here and she has to go to a terrible school there because it's a segregated school, why she can't drink at a water fountain. Think about that pain and what folks in that position had to go through. Think about the Irish who came here and saw signs, no Irish wanted, no jobs for you. It's a book written in my own state, Burlington, Vermont. A guy wrote a PhD thesis in the 1920s, I believe, that it was a big deal in the city of Burlington, Vermont, big deal, when a Catholic got a job in a bank, was a clerk in a bank. Broke a barrier, if you can believe it. So my point is, yeah, we should be nervous about where we are today. Think about from another perspective. A couple of years ago, I was at an event in northern Vermont. We were honoring World War II veterans. And a whole lot of folks were there, and the woman who was organizing the event showed us a video of December 8th, 1941. Anyone remember what that day was? That was the day after Pearl Harbor. And that was the day that Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war against Japan, and then a little while later declared war against Germany. On that day, the United States was forced to be in a position of fighting a war in Europe, fighting a war in Asia, and on that day in late December, we were totally unprepared to do that. Totally unprepared to fight against Germany, to fight against Japan. Yet 2.5 years later, because the country came together and developed a strong and effective military, we were producing the tanks, the guns, the planes that we needed. 2.5 years later, for all intents and purposes, the war was won. So what's the point? Yeah, things are bad. Things have been worse in the past. We have got to have the intelligence now not to live in despair or in fear, but to figure out how we're going to stand up, fight back in effective ways.
Can you run again? Will you?
Thank you. Thank you. Right now, all right. See, these are kinds of questions that the media asks. All right. Our job is not to worry about who's running in 4 years or in 10 years. Our job is to deal with today. Our job is to deal with Standing Rock today, to make sure that we protect our Native American brothers and sisters. Our job is to reach out to people all over this country who are struggling economically. Our job is to understand there are a lot of immigrants in this country today who are very, very frightened, Muslim people who are very, very frightened. We got a lot of work to do today. Don't worry about 2020. It'll come.
Do you think the Democratic Party establishment has learned any lessons this election year?
Well, all I can say is that some of us are working very, very hard as we speak. Let me give you some nuts and bolts about that. There's a guy who's a congressman from Minnesota. His name is Keith Ellison. And what Keith believes, and what I believe, and I think a majority of Americans believe, is that we need a major, major transformation of the Democratic Party. And you guys have got to be part of that process. We need to open up the doors of the Democratic Party to working people, to young people, to progressives. We got to welcome people into the party. We have got to be the party that stands with working families, that has the guts. Not easy. This is where the Democratic Party has lost ground. The Democratic Party today, as I think I mentioned earlier, it's not just we don't control the White House, we don't control the Senate, we don't control the U.S. House of Representatives, we don't control 2/3 of the governance seats in this country. And what the reason for that is a lot of people don't believe, with good reason, that the Democratic Party is today what it once was. If you go back to the 1940s, 1930s, and you would ask somebody on the street, which political party is the party of the working class of America? Without hesitation, vast majority of people would say it's the Democratic Party. Very few people think that that is the case today. And we have got to make that the case. Too many people are struggling economically. Too many people on top are acting in an incredibly greedy, often illegal way. And we have got to have the guts to take them on. And when we do that, you're going to see the Democratic Party do very well.
With our current media and their unwillingness to talk about the real issues, is there anything we can do to effectively help change the state of our news?
Yeah, there are, and let's talk about that. I mean, that's what my whole chapter is about, the last chapter. But it points out a few things. Let's get some facts there. Right now, there are a half a dozen major media conglomerates, Comcast being the largest, News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's organization being very powerful, Viacom, Time Warner, a couple of others, who control about 90% of the information that the American people see, hear, and read. By definition, it doesn't take a genius to figure this out, corporate media, their goal is not, by definition, to educate the American people. Their goal is to make as much money as they can. And I think you check it out, you'll see the heads of CNN and CBS, I believe, literally saying publicly, Donald Trump has been fantastic for our bottom line. The crazier the things that he says, more people watch it, we get more advertising, we make more money. All right? Check it out in terms of the kind of coverage that our campaign got compared to Donald Trump. For the year 2000, first 11 months of 2015, we were covered by ABC Evening News for 20 seconds. 20 seconds. And CBS and NBC were better, not a whole lot better. And there's a reason for that. Corporate media does not want to be challenged by people who are taking on the corporate establishment. That's not hard to understand. So I think this is a great assignment. I mean, in a sense, a great thing that I think we can do. I think millions of people across the political spectrum are tired of seeing all this stuff about the candidates and so little about the lives of ordinary people. People want to see their pain reflected on television, and they want to see serious discussion about how those issues are going to be addressed. Give you an example. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a study that came out that said that the Sunday news shows, Meet the Press and the others, virtually gave no coverage at all to climate change. No scientists were on their show. We brought in some senators and myself, we brought in some of the guys. A guy from CBS came in, and in fact, it changed just a little bit. But by and large, if you look at major, you tell me, all right, how much coverage there is on climate change, making the case that the debate is over. Climate change is real. What is the damage that it is doing? How do we protect the future of the planet? You don't see a whole lot of programming on that. You don't see a whole lot of programming about why the middle class in this country is disappearing. You see in the book, and I discovered this after the campaign, and I say this not in a bragging kind of way. Somebody did a study, and they said, I think it was the Sunday shows. They said, it turns out that poverty was discussed almost never, and 2/3 of the discussion of poverty on the Sunday shows was from Bernie Sanders. All right, so that doesn't speak to me. It means, how can you ignore 43 million people living in poverty? How can you ignore? You seen any programs lately on youth unemployment in minority neighborhoods? You don't see that. You seen any programs or many programs comparing the American healthcare system to other healthcare systems around the world? Any programs talking about why Canada is able to have a strong paid family and medical leave? The UK does it, Germany does it. We are the only major country on earth that does not do that. Do you see those types of discussion? You don't. What we can demand, look, they want you to buy their products. The function of television is not to present you information, it is to get you to buy. It's what takes place between the programming, the advertising. They want you to buy their products. You have power. You have power over the networks. If you tell them you're not going to buy the damn products, you're not going to watch the station unless they start reporting the news. So don't get me off on that one. That one I go on for a long one. But at the end of the day, what democracy must include is a well-educated, well-informed citizenry. And we can disagree, but we need good information. And certainly corporate media is not doing that. There was a study also, another study that came out, that said 90% of campaign coverage had nothing to do with the issues of importance to the American people. What they cover is gossip, what they cover is polls, what they cover is campaign, fundraising, what they cover is stupid things that somebody says, but they do not cover the issues facing the middle class. You can put pressure on them in whatever ways. You can think of these things as well as I can. But if you tell them, you tell the CNNs and the NBCs and the ABCs that you want real coverage on the real problems facing America, you can have some impact on that.
Okay. I have my own follow-up question to that. What do you think of the New York Times?
Pardon me?
What do you think of the New York Times?
Well, let's see. The coverage, somebody wrote it's embarrassing for me to have to talk about it. You should, study these things yourself. But, the New York Times, the Washington Post, from day one, never took our campaign seriously. When we announced, I think we made page 19 of the New York Times. If you go through, just Google it, go through the coverage. It was mostly negative coverage, not serious, all of the problems of our campaign. I don't want to make that as a blanket statement. There were some very good articles as well. But by and large, If you look, and the Washington Post was running, I think, in the heat of the moment, we're running about 4, 5, 6 articles a day on their website attacking us in every possible way. So, you know, we made the establishment very uncomfortable. The last thing in the world that they wanted to do is to see a president who was going to mobilize millions of people to take on the establishment. That is not what the New York Times wants. That's not what the Washington Post wants. And by the way, I mean, talking about establishment politics, this is, you know, in our campaign, I don't want to go through the whole thing, it's kind of in the book here, it's not having to take on the whole Democratic Party establishment or the media establishment. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of major newspapers throughout this country. Every state has major newspapers. We won the endorsement of one major newspaper in the United States of America, the Seattle Times. Thank you. But it is kind of funny when you think about it, that when you win 46% of the popular vote, that you end up getting one newspaper endorsement out of hundreds. That is what the establishment is about. That's what establishment television, establishment newspapers, corporate America. Taking on the establishment ain't easy, but I think what we learn and what makes me very optimistic from our campaign, starting knowing very little about the right things to do, we ended up showing that there is massive discontent. People are not happy with the way the establishment is running this country.
Okay, everybody, go out and subscribe now to the Seattle Times. We want to keep it around. What is the advantage of working within the DNC rather than setting up a new progressive subgroup?
Well, we're thinking about the best, way to go forward. Is right now, and I should tell you a little bit about my history, and I go into that in the book as well. You are looking at the longest serving independent in the history of the United States Congress. And again, what the book discusses, and it should give everybody here reasons for optimism, especially if you're thinking of getting into politics, is my first run for office in Vermont, I got 2% of the vote, running on a third party. Then, a year later, I ran again and I got 1%. Too dumb to quit. I ran again and I got 4%, and then I got 6%. And then finally I won mayor of Burlington, Vermont by 10 votes after a recount. Last time around, I won with 71% of the votes, so we made some progress over the years. But, how we focus, when I came into the United States Congress, the House in 91, I helped form the Progressive Caucus, which Keith Ellison is now the co-chair of, and it's one of the largest caucuses. And we are trying to find enough progressives in the Senate to do the same. That's a little bit hard. But, we are experimenting with ways that we can bring progressives together, and some good progressives, including Pramila, were just elected. It's going to strengthen our hands. But right now, what my task is, and what I'm going to give a real shot to, is to try to bring basic fundamental reforms to the Democratic Party. That's kind of where I am at this moment.
As individuals in society and citizens, how can our voice be heard by those in the government effectively?
The last thing that most politicians want is to have to deal with an educated, informed constituency. The last thing. In other words, what you don't know is that major pieces of legislation involving billions or tens or hundreds of billions of dollars are passed. Nobody writes about it. Defense bills pass $600 billion. Who cares? If we become involved, if we stand together, if we hold meetings like this and invite local officials to tell us why they're doing what they're doing or what we want. If we hold people accountable, and as I mentioned earlier, right here in Seattle, you have so much to be proud of. You are one of the most progressive cities in the United States, and what you have done has been heard all over this country. Your fight to raise the minimum wage gave the whole Fight for 15 boost the major, major push that it needed to succeed all over this country. So, you know, this is the wrong city to lecture because you're already doing this stuff. But you can, we talked about the media, you can think about it. How can you demand that media talk about the real issues, give all sides of the story? Why is it that in America today, 90% or so of talk radio is extreme right-wing in a nation which is politically divided? What can you do about it? You can turn on the damn radio and tell people who own the station here you want other points of view. I don't know what goes on here in Seattle. But that's what we can do as a nation. When, you know, I mentioned this a million times. If 1 million young people were to march on Washington, D.C., and tell the Congress that they wanted tuition-free public colleges and universities, and they wanted the student debt to be substantially lowered, it would happen. Because politicians look around and they say, oh my God, I got all these people, they're involved, they're thinking, they know how I'm gonna vote. I better vote the right way, right? It is not complicated. The leaders will follow when the people lead. And your job is to be leaders.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up with one more question. How do we protect and expand our voting rights over the next 4 years?
Well, I touched on that, and that is a very important question. There are some, and again, I don't want to characterize all Republicans in this light because it would not be true. But there are some who now see an opportunity to, in a sense, become the permanent majority party. And they will succeed, they feel, if they can allow billionaires very cleanly and effectively to buy elections. And that deals with campaign finance reform, which is why it is absolutely imperative that at every level, local, state level, New York City, for example, has public funding of elections. You want to run for mayor in New York, you get small amounts of contributions, you can get some public funding. Other states have some good ideas. Think about that as an antidote to Citizens United. Second of all is the issue of voter suppression. And on this one, there cannot be any compromise. We have all got to work together in any and every way that we can. I don't have the time to list all of the things that we can do. But our job is to increase voter turnout to make it easier for people to vote and to oppose any governor who wants to put impediments in the way of people participating in the political process. This is a major, major issue, and it is one of the highest priorities that I have, and I hope that you will share with me in understanding how important it is. We are fighting, look, we win elections, we lose elections. Majority is supposed to rule, but what some of these guys want to do is to make sure that people can't vote and billionaires buy elections. That is not democracy. That is oligarchy at work, and we have got to oppose that. Let me just conclude by thanking you. It's a wonderful turnout, and I love this city, and thank you so much for all that you do. And my message today is that you got to think about these things with your friends. You can come up with as good an idea as I can or anybody else can as to what we can do. But do not limit yourself to thinking that politics is just about voting every 2 years. Somebody just told me the other day, in terms of Standing Rock, that he withdrew his money from a bank which had investments in that pipeline. All right? All over this country, college students are demanding that their endowment funds at major university disinvest from fossil fuel industry. I mean, you know, whether it is the media, whether it is climate change, there are ways that we can be very, very effective. At the end of the day, when millions of people stand up and fight back effectively, they will not be denied. Not by Mr. Trump, not by anybody else. That is our job. Let's go forward. Thank you very much.